Beneath Barcelona's quarry walls, where Franco's opponents were flung to their deaths, memorials stand to the International Brigade. They show that, despite the Spanish Civil War ending in 1939, the exploits of the brigaders who came from around the world to fight Franco are not forgotten. Today, there are less than 30 of the original 60,000 brigaders alive. And 70 years later, 4 of the British and Irish volunteers have made the journey back to Spain. It is an emotional return and a period for reflection and remembrance. But the appreciation of them and the cause they volunteered to fight for is greater than ever. Alongside them is a handful of brigaders from around the world. Cuba, Russia, Austria, who also came as freedom fighters to oppose Franco and his fascist allies on the Spanish battlefields. The Spain that these volunteers came to over 70 years ago was nothing like the Spain we know today.
It was a country suffering a brutal civil war, a country where neighbor fought neighbor, brother fought brother, father fought son. Being here now, it's hard to imagine that time when whole communities were destroyed, villages wiped out, and the streets literally flowed with blood.
In the summer of 1936, from his base in the Canary Islands, General Franco had made his move to assume control from the newly elected Republican government. Using trusted Moorish troops who had already served under him in North Africa, as well as the loyal generals at army bases throughout Spain, the uprising was swift and violent. Assisted by the fascist Italian Air Force, who flew the Moors in from North Africa, Franco made a rapid and brutal advance towards Madrid. Hitler, having created a massive military arsenal in Germany, saw the Civil War as a chance to rehearse his troops for future conflicts. And soon, Franco had the might of the Nazi war machine on his side. Back in the UK, people were becoming increasingly concerned at the rise of fascism across Europe. When they began hearing first-hand tales of atrocities in Spain, they felt something had to be done. But it would have to be done in secret, as Britain had a strict policy of non-intervention in the conflict.
Well, we knew what it was about. We knew what it was about, what you were going to do. We knew there was one thing to do. We were going to beat fascism. That was the main thing, you know.
But I felt that here was an opportunity of fighting fascism. The Spanish, my first attitude was, well, the Spaniards don't need us. They've got plenty of men, their own men. What they need is arms. But after discussion, I was convinced myself that, well, if there was going to be foreign volunteers who were going, that's the place to be.
Well, I can't to tell you we felt we were fighting against odds anyway, because it was, you know, the Germans and Italians were on the side of Franco, so that we were fighting quite strong forces. But the cause was worthy. You had to try and help the Republic. Oh, and that's how I felt.
By the end of 1936, 1/3 of Spain was in Franco's hands. Any resistance was brutally dealt with as he marched north. Entire towns and villages sympathetic to the Republic were annihilated along the way. But Madrid had held firm, thanks in part to the International Brigade, and the capital remained in Republican hands. It had been a ferocious battle. Of the 36 British and Irish volunteers fighting at Madrid, only 6 had survived. As Franco plotted his next move, the men were sent away from the front to get some valuable rest and to explore the country they had come to save. For 22-year-old Jack Edwards, it was a far cry from Liverpool.
It seems to be encapsulated in the past, you know. And even when you went into towns like Valencia and Madrid, they had trams and stuff like that and cars. But when you went out into the agricultural areas outside the towns, it was very backward, very backward. And a lot of them couldn't read or write. The Spanish lads never went to school. And it seemed unusual that, you know, to meet somebody who'd never been to school, who couldn't read and couldn't write, because he couldn't write letters home. You know, to tell the parents how they were. And that's what struck me as very, very odd.
While recuperating on the French-Spanish border, volunteers from Britain were arriving to join the growing International Brigade.
Then they decided to start forming this International Brigade, more on a definite basis. Prior to that, you had everybody coming in, you know, and it wasn't organised to the extent it should have been.
But the new arrivals didn't have long to settle in. Franco was threatening the Coruña Road, some 30 miles west of Madrid. It was a crucial strategic point. Franco wanted to surround the capital by breaking through the heavily defended road.
One night the word went round the fascists had broken through, and so we were taken to the local railway station in Albacete, put on the train, and went to across Spain to a place called Andújar, where we detrained. But as we were getting out of the trains, we were already being attacked from the air, machine gun from the air. And I remember there was one of our first casualty on that side was a man whose name I remember, Harry Siegel his name was, and he was killed as he was getting out, because I saw it, as he was getting out of the truck and they were being machine gunned, and he was killed and his body fell to the ground before he even had the time even to get to the front.
The International Brigades were poorly armed. They were expected to take the town of Lopera, but found it heavily defended. And once again, Sam Lesser found himself on the front line.
The battle was fought, and we were again in a French battalion. The number of French had increased at that time, and we were, as we told, to advance. But then we came under very heavy fire and had to keep our heads down. I did my best, but not far from where I was stretched out. There was John Cornford was killed. There was Ralph Fox who was killed. There were again heavy casualties, and I was wounded.
The attack by the International Brigade had been disorganised and ineffective. 800 were killed as the British battalion retreated. But Sam Lesser was left critically wounded and dying on the battlefield. The battle for Lopera had been a disaster for the Republicans. 500 men had deserted and 800 corpses lay under the olive trees. Sam Lesser was missing, but he was neither a deserter nor was he dead. He was badly wounded and stuck in no man's land.
I didn't know at the time where I'd been wounded, in which part of my body, except that when I tried to get up, I just couldn't. I just fell down. There was something wrong in my legs. And as the day progressed, our people had to withdraw, retreat, And I was lying there and I couldn't move. There was no possibility of stretcher bear or anything. And I was lying there and should always remember learned the word of what was the name for stretcher bearer in French and Spanish. Brancardier in French and camarero in Spanish.
Sam had been shot in the leg and in the back. Bleeding heavily and alone, he needed urgent help. When his colleagues realized he was missing, one of them went out to find him.
And apparently others said, "It's no use, Jock. He's a dead un, he's a goner, and if you go out, you'll be a goner too." Jock, to his credit, said he's going out, and he went and looked and found me. And then literally dragged me because he couldn't find a stretcher, dragged me. I discovered that I'd got a bullet in my left leg and also in my back. It was the first experience I had for what in World War II became to be called friendly fire. In the French, our French comrades who were on our right flank to support our advance, but were sending crossfire across. And when they saw us, we had apparently advanced too quickly, and they opened fire on us. Friendly fire had not been invented at that time, but we knew what the hell it was when we came across it.
As the battle continued, Sam was carried to a small team of British doctors and nurses who had all volunteered for the cause. 27-year-old Penny Fievel had left her nursing post in England and made her way down to Spain, while Dubliner Paddy Cochrane drove his ambulance all the way from London to the front line.
When the Spanish War broke out, I hitchhiked down to London. I went to the communist headquarters, and they wouldn't take me because I hadn't got any military skill. But mind you, later they did. Wherever you were, you two were taken. But then I was looking in the News Chronicle, and there was wanted drivers for Spain, ambulances, to take ambulances out to Spain and maintain and keep them out there. And there was 6 ambulances sent out. I was one of them.
While the ambulance drivers ferried the sick and wounded, the doctors and nurses did what they could to save lives.
As they were coming off, picking them up and dropping them, we were picking laparotomies, tummies, amputations, right, head injuries there, and taking them like that. And all they had on their shoulders was the cross to say that they had anti-tetanus and morphine. And if they weren't bad enough for immediate operation, they were taken down the second line of evacuation. Then they'd go on their third. But we operated only on the most urgent. That was the laparotomies, trephines and the amputations. We had 3 tables going with the other surgeon, who helped, the Spanish, and there were the Spanish nurses. Not that they knew a thing, but they were soon learnt. Then we used to use the morphine and, drips, We used to run out of that then. It was very, very difficult. Used to use, but some of them were too far gone for, to have any stuff to put them out. But there were terrible, terrible losses.
While the brigaders struggled to fight with outdated weapons on the front, the medical teams also had a shortage of equipment.
They faced enormous difficulties. I mean, the buildings they were given to turn into hospital, very often it was like turning a pigsty into a hospital. Yet having said that, there's a general consensus that you got better treatment at the front and the Republican side during the Spanish Civil War than you did in some of the best teaching hospitals in London. There were incredible improvements around particularly blood transfusion technology. There were great advances made in terms of triage, how to select who should get treatment quickest in a way that was to the good of everyone. And the nursing, I think again it's widely recognised that the nurses, the British and Commonwealth, or British Empire as it was then, nurses, you know, were of a standard quite unlike anything that had been seen in Spain before. And there's a huge difference in the quality of the medical care on the Republican side and on the nationalist side, which was much more primitive.
By January 1937, the brigade had retreated from La Pera. They had been soundly beaten and suffered many casualties. But within a month, they would be back in action. In the south of Spain, Franco's troops had easily taken Malaga. As the Republican population fled, they were bombed by the Navy and Air Force. And in the city itself, 4,000 Republicans were shot. Encouraged by their success in Malaga, Franco's soldiers renewed their efforts to take Madrid. Having failed once by trying to bomb its citizens into submission, Franco now decided to take the capital by cutting its supply routes.
Franco then engaged in an operation to try to cut off Madrid from Valencia, which was the great lifeline. And so there was this huge encircling operation, and the brigades were heavily involved in that, and that collectively tends to be known as the Battle of Jarama. And in the Battle of Jarama, I mean, there was one day where the British battalion was virtually wiped out.
The site of the Jarama battlefield is peaceful now. There are no signs of the death and destruction that once took place here. But in 1937, these fields were flowing with blood as Franco tried to cut the Valencia road.
Valencia Road was the most important of all. It was the road where the Republican government received reinforcements, ammunition, and the evacuation of the population through Valencia, you know. It was really important for the Republican capital city. It was in February, the battle will be in February 37. They crossed the hills, they conquered the hills, crossed the Jarama River, and they begin the battle in the olive trees labyrinth. You know, it was going to be in the second part of the battle.
The nationalists poured thousands of troops into Jarama to take on the Republicans. In a grim forewarning of what was to come, countless stretcher bearers made their way to the front. Straight away, Franco's troops gained the upper hand. Their heavy artillery and the fighting ability of his elite army enabled them to advance rapidly. But the Republicans fought back heroically despite huge losses, with the International Brigade at the forefront of the action. In the rolling hills, attack followed attack, but somehow the Republicans held out. On February 23, 1937, the battle reached its climax with devastating consequences on both sides. On that day alone, 1,500 men lost their lives in attack and counterattack. As Jarama became a stalemate, the entire 600-strong British battalion of the International Brigade was virtually wiped out in one afternoon. Before the Battle of Jarama ended in the summer of 1937, 45,000 men from both sides would have died on these fields.
The thing you need to remember about Franco is, because he thought that he was doing the work of God, the number of casualties never mattered to him. He really never cared. And so in a sense, a battle of attrition in which there were large numbers of casualties on both sides, suited him down to the ground. And that's effectively what happened in Jarama. Effectively, Jarama was a stalemate, although you could say it was, if anything, it was a Republican victory in that it kept the road open. But it was a victory gained at enormous human cost. And in a way, the same was true of every other battle. You know, Brunete, Belchite, you know, one after another, it was the same story.
The Battle of Jarama had been a bloody encounter. But as the International Brigade regrouped, they knew that if they were to defeat fascism, many more volunteers would have to die on the battlefields of Spain. On the rolling hills of Jarama, the battle to cut off Madrid continued throughout the spring of 1937. It wasn't only the soldiers on the front line who were busy. Nurse Penny Fievel was also in the thick of the action.
You were prepared, you got all your stuff ready for a big offensive, whichever side was attacked. And so it might have been we were going to be attacked, so we would be prepared, and then when it would start, you were ready. And it would be horrific, casualties on both sides. But if it was and it would last for quite a few days, then there'd be a gradual clearing off. And things would settle down and you try and reorganise yourself. And then there'd be a counter-attack. So that you had to get ready for. Many a time I had to take the ambulance and go to Madrid to replenish some of our stuff.
Back on Jarama battlefield, the Republicans were holding firm despite their massive casualties. To escape the incessant bombing, they took sanctuary in caves dug out in the hillside. The Nationalist front advanced a few miles, but made no strategic gain. Madrid remained in Republican hands and was yet to be entirely surrounded. At Jarama, the ill-equipped Republicans had demonstrated that they were heroically brave in defense. But between them, both sides had lost thousands in creating this bloody stalemate.
Heavy losses, it should never have happened. If it had been, it needed doing, you know, someone with knowledge of war. You see, they were all youngsters and inexperienced. And a lot of lives were lost that should never have been lost. But there it is, that's life, I suppose.
Back in Albacete, Sam Lesser was recuperating from his wounds and had taken a desk job relaying communications from the front line.
We had a messenger who had come, a communications man from the battalion, to Albacete with the casualty list. And we knew that there had been very heavy fighting, but we were absolutely horrified when we saw this casualty list. I've forgotten the actual number, but there was a problem, and I remember talking over with Kerrigan what the problem we had to at the time was how to get this information to London. Don't forget that we were not a sort of army that had been, say, like the British Army with lines of communication, offices and communication set out. And the problem also of how you get the communication, the information of our casualties to the families of those who had been killed or wounded.
The news of the losses eventually filtered back home, and it was up to the likes of Jack Jones, who was recruiting volunteers, to break the tragic news to wives and families.
That was pretty terrible, yes, it was. But I was sort of the organiser of the forces supporting the Republic in Liverpool. And so I had that sort of response. In a way, I felt responsible, along with fellow named Joe Cummings, who was more or less a lad who was doing it full time, trying to recruit and helping whatever possible and making contact with the wives and so on. The men who went to Spain.
You must have gone to see some young wives with
right.
children.
That's true, very true. And that was a sad thing, in a way. You know, we tried to raise money whatever we could with the support of the local trade union branches and that sort of thing. But for the rest, if they were widowed, they got widow's pension from the state, and it was pretty awful situation, frankly.
At Haram, the majority of fighting was limited to artillery fire, followed by set-piece offensives, which were often assaults across an open no-man's land. The better-equipped fascists dominated. Franco had obtained $700 million worth of resources and services from wealthy industrialists keen to hedge their bets on the future political landscape of Europe.
But one of the things you've got to remember is that Franco, and this is slightly different from the First World War, Franco had enormous mobility in terms of moving his troops around. This was because the Ford Motor Company had given him 12,000 of the latest trucks on tick, and the Texaco oil company had met all his fuel needs on tick. And so basically, because of this mobility, Franco was always able to bring up huge reinforcements relatively quickly, and of course enjoyed massive air superiority.
This air superiority was to have devastating consequences for the Republicans as Franco moved his attention north. Here in the region around Bilbao, the Republicans had their industry, and Franco used the Luftwaffe to destroy it with crippling effect. And industry wasn't his only target, as the fearsome Condor Legion unleashed their bombs on the town of Guernica on its market day.
Terrific. I remember, I can't think, I was standing somewhere on my own, high up on a veranda of some sort, and I don't know where it was, and I heard about Guernica, and I stood there alone, high on this high building, and I don't know what I was thinking about. Couldn't imagine it. The terrible, terrible things that happened, that people should do it.
It was felt really downhearted over it, you know, because they could get there and bomb it and clear it all, and people started getting away, and I knew children were coming back here, because the wife wrote to me, you know. That's the only information we got back about it, really. We didn't get it in any newspapers or anything.
During the summer, the Republicans tried hard to halt Franco's seemingly inexorable progress. As territory was being whittled away, a well-planned offensive at Brunetti achieved initial surprise as 50,000 Republicans smashed through enemy lines. For 10 days, in one of the bloodiest encounters of the war, the Republicans defended their gains. But the nationalists were aided by the Messerschmitt 109, a terrifying new weapon. In conditions of total chaos, with both sides mistakenly bombing their own troops, the nationalists forced the Republicans back to their starting point. In August 1937, the Republicans switched their attention towards the Aragon front in an effort to distract Franco's forces from their offensive in the north. They struggled to capture some towns along the way, such as Belchita. The fighting here was ferocious. Amongst the International Brigade caught in the firefight at Belchita was Irishman Bob Doyle.
Well, I was fighting in between the trees, and I could see the fascists moving. and they kept firing. And they were firing at me, and the bullets were hitting the wall behind. And I don't know how it missed me. I stood up. I wanted to get killed, not from bravery, but I thought this was going to be the other bloke. One bloke was killed beside me, and he was lying down. It was all stones, and I stood up and kept firing, and the bullets kept coming behind. I don't know how they missed me. I still don't know.
Vastly outgunned, there was little hope of the Republic taking Belchita. The decision to use tanks was a disaster as they became stuck in the narrow streets. It was here that the Republicans were slaughtered in the alleyways, sitting ducks for the enemy. Few survived, and those that did were rounded up by Franco's troops to expect death by firing squad. And Bob was one of them.
Fascist operatives come up with rifles, so they were a firing squad. We stood for them. So we all made our way towards the front to get shot first.
But Bob was lucky. Being one of the British battalion, he was spared execution. Franco, trying to keep Britain's non-intervention policy alive, would not sanction the execution of a British prisoner unless they were captured twice. Instead, Bob was taken to the church at Belchita and interrogated. Back in Britain, the news of casualties amongst the brigaders had led to a shortfall in volunteers. Some of those in Spain were enlisted to drum up support.
I went home for a while, for a little while, and spoke to people. And that's where the one person yelled out in a big hotel or a big hall, "Spain is red." And I said, "Yes, it is red. It's red with blood." And I said, "My arms are filled with it right up to my sleeves." "Yes, it's red," I said. Yes, I always remember that.
Those that did go to Spain found the Republicans and the International Brigade in crisis. In the harsh winter of 1937-38, Franco decided to launch another attack on what had become his obsession, Madrid. Discovering his strategy, the Republicans decided to launch their own preemptive attack in the hope of repelling Franco. It was to be directed against the bleak province of Teruel. As the Republicans attacked, the temperature dropped to the lowest recorded in the 20th century.
Teruel, we were stationed, we were just outside Teruel, really, in a village. I know it was bloody cold, because we had some oranges and they got bloody frozen. That's how bloody cold it was.
It was the only time during the war that the capital of a province fell to the Republican Army. So that was very important. But of course, it was the same old story. The attack starts in December 37. By the end of January of 1938, Franco is flooding the area with troops and gradually takes back Teruel.
With Franco having retaken Teruel and Republican refugees fleeing for their lives, the fascists undertook a massive offensive through Aragon and Castillon towards the sea.
And in fact, in the middle of 15th of April 1938, the Francoists actually reach the sea at Vinaroz, which splits the Republican zone in two. Very difficult after that point to see how the Republic could have won.
But while Franco's soldiers frolicked in the waves, their leader convinced the end was near. The Republicans were planning one last offensive, the most audacious and the bloodiest action of the war. The River Ebro had become the new demarcation line between the opposing sides. The Republicans planned a dramatic crossing of 80,000 troops to draw Franco away from attacking Valencia. On the 24th and 25th of July, Republican troops managed to cross the river and advance several miles west. But this was just the beginning of the battle, as the fascists threw all they had at the enemy amongst the hills of the Ebro. It became the Republicans' graveyard.
Yes, well, of course, increasingly, some of us historians of the war think the Ebro was a terrible mistake. It's always regarded, of course, as the great, glorious last throw of the Republic. But given the superiority in arms, in numbers of men, that by this stage the Republic was having to call up 15, 16-year-olds, the huge weight of superiority of the nationalists, their ability to move armies around very fast, seems to me, at least, and to other military, more specialised military historians than I am, that it was a big mistake. There was a lot of unnecessary slaughter.
The hilly area around the Ebro might be hard to attack, but it was even harder to defend. The Republicans had positioned themselves on the undefended hilltops, but Franco was determined to recover lost ground. With nearly 1 million men now under arms, he could afford casualties in his counterattack. The Republicans, thinking they were invincible on their hilltops, found themselves trapped when Franco cut off their supplies. And surrounded by 500 cannon, they suffered over 13,000 shells raining down on them every single day for 4 months.
What do you think, looking back over that time, made these men endure? And what was the spirit that drove them on?
Well, they were really strong, and the Republican units. At the end of the Civil War, we can say that the Ebro Army, that is the best unit on the Republican side of the whole war, we can compare them in quality with the fascist units, with the legionnaires and with the regulars and with the Carlists, but with no area superiority and with no artillery superiority.
So immensely brave men.
Day after day, the fascists attacked, slowly retaking one hill after another. The Republicans defended as best they could, but it wasn't enough. As the summer of 1938 turned to autumn, Franco's fascists, thanks to their superior air and artillery power, had pushed the Republicans out of their Ebro summits. The British battalion of the International Brigade had lost over 90 men, and the Republicans had lost an army. Effectively, the Republic was defeated, and Spain was in Franco's hands. On September the 21st, 1938, the Republic announced its intention to repatriate all foreign volunteers as it began a search for a possible peace formula. But for 2 more days, the British fought at the Ebro with devastating results.
We're looking at history here.
Yeah, we touch the names of the people who died here. 40 of them were killed the last day of the battle, 23rd of September. They know perfectly that it was going to be the last day in battle and the last day in the Spanish Civil War. And they did not say no. They came back to combat and they fight the last day. But 40 of them were the last day. That's sad, really, really sad.
On October the 29th, 1938, a farewell parade was held in Barcelona for the International Brigade. In the presence of many thousands of tearful but cheering Spaniards, the brigaders marched past.
It was a terrible day for us because we didn't want, and our people didn't want to leave Spain. But decisions were taken. The government of the Republic, headed by Juan Negrin, made this gesture of withdrawing the foreign volunteers in the vain hope, although they couldn't have believed that anything would happen, that Hitler or Mussolini would respond. It was not a parade that you see of well-equipped soldiers, well-uniformed, a very ragged lot of the people who had survived and were marching past, many of them with tears in their eyes, as I had too, because we knew that, not because of our withdrawal, but because the Spanish people had been betrayed and that we couldn't help, we were not allowed to help them anymore.
The sun had set on the International Brigade's time in Spain. At the farewell parade, the Republican Prime Minister finished with the words, "Come back as honoured sons of Spain." And 70 years later, they have returned. Honoured for their fight against Franco and fascism 70 years ago, it's a chance for the people of Spain to say thank you to the men and women who put their lives on the line in the name of freedom.
I'm absolutely overwhelmed, really. I knew we would get a good welcome, but this is absolutely quite fantastic, you know. The way we've been treated now, after all these 70 years.
Well, it's, you know, a remembrance day for me. There were hard and difficult times, but to feel that there has been progress one way or another made is a great encouragement to continue to take an interest in my old age.
Back on the home ground.
All these people turn out for people like you.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel?
Oh, it feels good about people, you know. Makes you think it was worthwhile. They're all for democracy, and they're carrying on the fight, and that's the main thing.
With the International Brigades gone, Franco entered Barcelona on December the 23rd, 1938, and 37 years of brutal dictatorship began. Almost 60,000 volunteers had come to Spain. Nearly 10,000 of them had been killed. Of the 2,500 British volunteers, almost 500 of them had died. But they all knew this was the last great cause.
War is a terrible, terrible thing. I think it's the worst thing that can happen. Such a lot of unnecessary slaughter and misery. They were also very precious in a way, because life itself was precious. But it was a wonderful experience.
Well, I've got my firm beliefs. And I think if you've got firm beliefs and you've been brought into it, you would do it again, yeah. I wouldn't hesitate. I still feel proud to have been to Spain. I still feel very proud of it.
Well, our cause, in a sense, was justified subsequently. So, in a way, we feel that ours was a little part, but it was in the proper, progressive direction, justified later by the war against fascism in general, you know, in which the whole country were involved.
The men and women from Britain and Ireland who came to Spain to fight for freedom were determined, defiant, and full of conviction for their actions.
And I've interviewed the last 9 of them, the last survivors. And of each I asked, would you do it again? And each one said, yes.
One of the Spanish Civil War's most brutal acts, the bombing of Guernica, is revisited in a moment with the extraordinary account of the 4,000 Basque refugee children from the city who were evacuated to Britain.
Picasso's famous painting Guernica is perhaps the single most potent symbol of the horrors of modern warfare. The painting immortalizes the bombing of the small Basque town of Guernica in 1937 during Spain's bloody civil war. But there is a story beyond the events at Guernica, a story with which Britain was intimately involved. It is the story of 4,000 refugee children who were sent to Britain from the Basque country to escape the ravages of the Spanish Civil War.
So Dad said we got to let them go. If they're here, they could get killed.
The children left behind them all that was precious to seek sanctuary.
I still remember that moment of pain and sorrow.
By any measure, it was a momentous historical event.
It was the biggest single influx of refugees into this country that there had ever been.
So why has such an extraordinary historical episode been ignored? In this film, we reveal for the first time a remarkable conflict between a British government that saw the children as a political embarrassment and a popular movement that was sympathetic to their plight and which cared for them throughout their stay. This is their story, the story of the Guernica children. The name of Guernica, the ancient capital of the Basque country in the north of Spain, holds a special notoriety in the history of warfare. Spain's civil war had been underway for nearly a year, but the town of Guernica was nowhere near the front line. That was to change dramatically on Monday, the 26th of April. Guernica was about to become center stage in the conflict. It was market day, and the streets were busy.
The German Air Force, who had been dispatched to Spain to help Franco's and the nationalist cause, bombed Guernica on Monday the 26th of April, 1937. Over a period of 3.5 hours, successive waves of the Condor Legion literally destroyed the town. The number of people who were killed, nobody knows. Virtually not a building was left standing. It was the first time an Air Force had systematically and ruthlessly and rationally sought to terrify a civilian population, because Guernica was not a military target.
The events in Guernica brought into sharp focus a conflict that had been raging since the July of 1936.
Spain had been edging towards civil war since the Republic was formed in 1931. And this culminated in a revolt by the leading generals. But what the generals thought was going to be a quick, easy coup d'etat turned into a civil war which lasted the best part of 3 years.
The nationalist insurgents, led by General Franco, had the support of Europe's other fascist leaders, Hitler and Mussolini. Both Germany and Italy poured in huge quantities of arms, ammunition, and military personnel to support General Franco's nationalist army. British foreign policy was more concerned with appeasing Hitler in the hope of avoiding another world war. In September of 1936, Britain helped broker the non-intervention treaty. Spain would be left to its own devices. The major powers of Europe would not get involved. As Guernica showed, the treaty didn't work. Germany and Italy continue to pour in military assistance to help Franco's forces. Spain's Republican government appealed for international support, but Britain refused. The nationalist advance had cut Spain in two, isolating the Basque region in the north of the country, which remained loyal to the Republic. The Basque country had a strong tradition of independence. It was culturally quite distinct from the rest of Spain, with its own customs and language. The destruction of Guernica, the region's symbolic capital, was the price for the Basques' stubborn resistance. Across the region there was panic at this new form of warfare. Civilians fled their homes and converged on the region's most important city, Bilbao. But there was no escape from the bombing.
Pues aquí veíamos venir los aviones desde esos montes que son al monte de Archanda. Veíamos venir los aviones a bombardear esto. Teníamos que esconder ahí en los sótanos y un refugio que había ahí detrás. Primera vez, claro, mucho miedo, porque yo no había visto nunca un avión así en aquellos tiempos. Y ver que venían unos cuantos juntos y echar esas bombas que luego hacían fuego y todo, pues, hombre, te llamaba la atención.
Bilbao was virtually undefended from these aerial attacks, but occasionally a few of the Republic's aged aeroplanes were scrambled to engage the German bombers.
You could see the battles in the sky, and we saw a German plane kind of explode. And you could see like the pilot, the master, well, the soldiers, it was the pilot. You could see it coming down like a little toy, you know, coming down, coming down, coming down. And unfortunately, when they arrived, it was only about 100 yards or 100 meters from where we were. And as he was coming down, he was going with the machine gun, shooting with the machine gun. And of course, everybody was coming close and close to him. And when they arrived, when they landed on the ground, they caught him, and that was it.
Even before the events at Guernica, there had been talk of evacuating children to safety in Britain, France, Mexico, and the Soviet Union. The National Joint Committee for Spanish Relief had been lobbying Stanley Baldwin's government, which had firmly rebuffed the idea.
The Foreign Office was initially opposed to any notion of evacuating non-combatants from the Basque region to Britain. Their argument was that it would constitute an act of intervention and would therefore contravene the Non-Intervention Pact. The British ambassador, for instance, spoke of removing useless mouths from this scene of conflict in Bilbao particularly would enable the Basques to resist the nationalist forces that much longer, and therefore it was effectively intervening in the civil war.
Huge demonstrations all over England expressed their sympathy.
But the bombing of Guernica forced the government to change its position.
The pressure was mounting in the wake of Guernica. You can read the minutes in some of the Foreign Office meetings whereby they indicate that they are just frightened that the National Joint Committee for Spanish Relief was going to bring boatloads of children and park them outside Portsmouth, in which case the British government wouldn't be able to turn them back without it causing a great public outcry.
With public opinion now firmly in favour of evacuating children from the Basque country, the government finally relented. The evacuation could go ahead. The National Joint Committee for Spanish Relief immediately put its plans into motion. It also requested that the British government should match their fundraising effort pound for pound. The answer was a resounding no. The government would not contribute a penny. In Britain, a Basque Children's Committee was established to coordinate the relief effort, headed by Tory MP, the Duchess of Atholl.
Well, Duchess, what's the verdict?
Well, I'm glad to be able to tell you that the position of the government is quite clear. They're not prepared to undertake relief measures themselves, except as part of an international scheme. But the Home Office will allow these children to come here, provided they are selected without any regard to the political views of their parents, provided they are maintained here entirely from voluntary subscription, and become no charge on public funds.
With bombs now falling daily on Bilbao, parents were desperate to enlist their children for evacuation to France, the Soviet Union, Mexico, and to Britain.
So Dad said, we got to let them go. He said, look, they're only young, they've got their lives in front of them, and they'll make their way in life if anything happens to us. But if they're here, they could get killed, they could starve to death because we don't know what would happen. Who's going to look after them here? So you might as well send them to England.
I remember that one day we were bombed again, and my father decided, and my mother of course, to send me away anywhere for at least to be one of us to carry the name, I suppose. We went to different places to join, to Mexico, Russia, places like that, but they were all full. And we happened to go to the one for Great Britain, and it was a vacancy, so that's where I came.
A medical team was sent to Bilbao to help with the preparations, but their work was severely hampered by the constant air raids.
The doctors examined us, and while we were in the queue waiting to go into the office, they started machine gunning us. The planes came over and started machining us. So just before that, Papa said to us, now if planes come, don't panic. Because what we did panic. Because we ran, we scattered all the children, and I think they killed some of them.
By the 21st of May, the expedition to Britain was ready for departure.
El barco era en La Habana y estaba anclado ahí en el puerto de Santurce. Claro que ahora, como han pasado 70 años, han hecho un muelle aquí, otro allí, que no existían. Salió de La Habana con 4.000 niños, entre los cuales iba mi hermana Anita y yo.
There was this great big boat. Never seen a big boat in my life like that. It was packed with children. And it was terrible because some of them were screaming, crying, and the parents didn't want to let them go. And it was really terrible. Eventually, the three of us, and with Mama and Papa, we said goodbye and hugged. Of course, I wouldn't let go of my mother's skirts. And in the end, they had to drag me away, Carmen and Angel, and take me on, you see.
She was a baby, you see. I nearly put my mother's coat off.
My mother was pregnant at the time, so my father came down to the port, and I remember being handed over to be put into the boat. I remember quite clearly my poor father's sort of reaction, just turning suddenly and just leaving quickly once he had handed us over. And then it was really that I suddenly realized the implications of the separation. And I still remember that moment of pain and sorrow.
When I had to say goodbye, and he said, well, do your best and look after yourself and that sort of thing. And you start walking towards the station, and then you look back and you see them weeping and crying. Then something dropped on me, and I said, good God, you know, that was a very, very sad moment for me, which I'll never, you know, even now when I'm telling you, I can feel it.
I think it was a spirit of adventure somehow, you know. We were only coming for 3 months. That's all we were told. Oh, we'll be back in no time, you know, like a long holiday. I don't think it went deep enough because we didn't realize how serious the situation was and became more serious later on, of course.
The 4,000 children were on their way to safety, or so they thought.
Hombre, pues se había hablado de que estaba el Cervera, me parece que era así, un barco de Franco, pero estábamos con miedo, sí.
The captain of Franco's ship sent a message to the Havana captain saying that he had to turn back with all the children back to Spain. If not, he would sink us. Now then, we were told that he did turn back, but at the same time he sent a message to the English ships that were near to come and help us.
Despite the British policy on non-intervention, 2 British battle cruisers were soon on the scene to escort the Havana to safety.
Whatever you think about non-intervention, it was interpreted in such a shameless way, it seems to me, whereby on the one hand we could use our own forces, our own navy, to escort children here, there and elsewhere. But once they were here, not a penny of public money was to be spent on their support. I mean, nowhere else in Europe, to where Spanish refugee children went, was non-intervention interpreted in this way.
And the adventures were by no means at an end.
It was a rough journey, that was horrible. Well, to me it was hell. That's the only way you can describe it. I was being sick all the time. There were so many of us. It was unbelievable that so many crying. One was crying,
She was crying all the
screaming.
time.
Terrible.
I used to carry her up the top for fresh air on my back. No wonder I got a bad back.
When we got to the top, it was so many children there, and they were all being sick. It was like a skating rink.
It was pretty awful. We slept on the floor, and we had no overcoats, my brother or myself, just the clothes we had on. The little bag of clothes that my mother had made were put into a wire cage, and we never saw them again. With the rough seas, we were rolling about, being sick, and rolling in each other's and our own vomit. It was pretty horrible.
And best foreign news of the week, from the horrors of civil war to the peace of England, come 4,000 Basque children, refugees from...
Of hope.
When Franco died, I couldn't believe it because it's been so many years there. And I thought, now is a chance. Now is the time to go and come back to a democracy in Spain. But of course, we had our homes here.
Just by here,
And our 4 sons who were born in here.
Cheers.
I'm very settled here after all these years. Thank you very much.
Come on, get in there now.
I feel Welsh now.
You got to attack them, well, it's no other way.
When I go to London and I speak to somebody, they tell me, it must be the accent, I suppose. Oh, is it you Welsh? Yes, I am Welsh, yes. I got to tell them yes, because otherwise I'll have to give a lot of explanation.
I want to throw 2 points away today.
So, in a way, I suppose I am half Welsh, half Spanish, or half Basque, I don't know.
In the end, it was for the best for us. Although we left Mum and Dad behind, and we came to England, we still love them. Once you become a parent yourself, you can understand how you must feel when you do have to say goodbye to a child, what they must have felt, how hard it must have been for them. It was hard for us, but it must have been harder for them.
I've often looked back myself and wondered what it was we thought we were doing. As far as the children were concerned, the best we could claim that we did was to make some impression on the young minds about what England is like, what sort of place it is, what's the truth, as it were, about England. I think it's very important that for the rest of their lives they should have had a picture in their minds of some of the good things that motivated the people who helped them.
Ya le he dicho que para mí en el mundo está Euskadi y después Inglaterra. Inglaterra porque estoy agradecido a cómo me han tratado.
So many people from different organisations or no organisations, religious backgrounds or not, were drawn into this. These children lived in this country entirely on the support of the public. But eventually, as they stayed and they stayed and they ceased to be news and they ceased to be newsworthy, and yet still they were here, still needing to be looked after, individual people continued to support these youngsters. That was tremendous.
In less than a minute, the battlefield detectives investigate Hitler's last great gamble of the Second World War, his attack in the Ardennes in 1944, which took the Allied armies by surprise.